Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. We are reversing the lens today. Rather than looking at America from the inside, we're looking at it from the outside in with an old friend of mine, Peter Bale. He's a longtime media executive. He's based in New Zealand. He's had very senior jobs at CNN and News Corp and all sorts of other big media companies. In fact, we met many years ago in CNN. He had me on his show to talk about technology. He is a native New Zealander and now is back in New Zealand. Peter, welcome to Keane on America.
Andrew, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be on, since I see some really serious intellectual names. So I'm not sure I can quite live up to the intellectual billing, but it'll be great to have a conversation with you, and it's lovely to see you.
Well, do your best, Peter. If you're no good, we won't run you.
You'll just spike it. Yes. Yes.
So
we can talk about what the spike was if you want at some point when we get into the media section, but do carry on.
Well, what's the view then? Very simple, easy question, Peter. What's the view from New Zealand of the United States? Have you been shocked, so to speak, those famous words from Casablanca, with what's been happening over the last few years?
Yeah, I think, very hard to put the views of 5.5 million people on one person, but I would say there is a perception that it is the last, since 2016, we have been in extraordinary times. And I think since Trump was re-elected, of course, the speed of action, what he learned from that first term, the speed of action on so many huge things that affect us all globally, has left us over here, 18,000 miles away, just as punch drunk as anybody there. And it does affect us in very strong ways. It's the Trump era has affected dialogue in New Zealand. It's affected daily conversation, but also when you so for example, with tariffs, New Zealand had 15% tariffs, which of course, again, we do again today. And that really jolted people, I think, and certainly jolted the government, because the government here is, particularly the current government, which is a somewhat conservative, small c conservative one, really felt it had done its best to be at Washington's side. Small countries like New Zealand depend on the international rule of law. So that kind of thing has really been very disruptive. And then you've got the sort of unilateralism that a small country like New Zealand fears when you think about, whether it's the Maduro thing in Venezuela or the potential for an attack on Iran that is without any UN or international consensus. So I think there's an incredulity, but there's the same punch-drunk nature. I mean, I admit I am a journalist, but I wake up in the middle of the night, probably at 3 o'clock in the morning, check my phone to see what fresh hell has come out. And it's usually 2 words: Trump threatens.
And of course, Trump threatens, and people are beginning to punch back now. What do you make of the Carney doctrine, or at least of Mark Carney? He's behaving certainly, if not as a Canadian, as a New Zealander, in being willing, or an Australian, or perhaps a Frenchman, in being willing to punch back. Has there been a very positive response to this thing now called the Carney doctrine of medium-sized countries like Canada or New Zealand or Australia standing up for themselves against the United States?
Up to a point, but the government here is a bit wimpy about that. The government is extremely cautious, or the current ruling government, which is a coalition of one conservative, rather right-wing nationalist group, a libertarian group, and then a sort of somewhat more English-style conservative group party. They have been extremely cautious of that. The foreign minister in New Zealand is nearly 80. And he's grown up with that kind of, the Americans protected us, the Americans are under the shield.
Is this, Peter, the
Winston Peters
of New Zealand? That's what
I'm sure
one of your local newspapers called him.
Yeah, it's a very good phrase. He is a man full of character, is very influenced by by the United States and really believes in that alliance. Because, of course, you will remember that New Zealand tested that alliance in the mid-'80s by going non-nuclear, and that led, so we denied access to an American ship, which then broke what was then called the ANZUS Treaty, the Australia, New Zealand, US Defence Treaty. And so New Zealand was on the out with the United States for many years, and he has been very determined to be quite conservative about this. He did welcome elements of the Carney speech at the World Economic Forum, but he also said, hang on a minute, I think Carney's been listening to what I've been saying. So he took some credit for Carney, which I think is probably a little ridiculous. But New Zealand is part of this.
So it's like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards.
Yeah.
He considers if Carney is Jagger, then Peters is Keith Richards.
Yeah. I think that I'm going to write to him and tell him that that's a very good parallel. But it is this. New Zealand is part of this kind of 40-nation loose grouping at the moment of a sort of coalition of the willing coming in behind Carney. And I think New Zealand will also be very strongly aligned with Anthony Albanese, even though he's the Australian Prime Minister, even though it's a Labour centre left government there and a centre right government here, because where Australia goes, we tend to go fairly soon after.
Although I'm not sure all New Zealanders would quite put it in those terms. No,
they wouldn't. Although there is a discussion about whether we should be the seventh state of Australia.
Yeah, I like the phrase "coalition of the willing." I think it was borrowed probably from Bush 1 or 2 or 3.
Yes.
Peter, whatever happened to Jacinda Ardern? There was an interesting piece in the New Yorker a couple of years ago about why New Zealand turned on her. At one point, she was your brand, a very articulate, impressive woman. What happened to her? And what does this tell us perhaps of the way in which maybe Trumpism has become internationalized?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Andrew. As usual, you put your finger on it. That there was, so she led. No, she. Well, I came back to New Zealand after maybe 35, 40 years of, more than that, 50 years of living abroad, and she was the Prime Minister when I arrived in 2020, just as the COVID pandemic was starting to spread. And you will recall that the Jacinda Ardern government imposed extremely strict curbs on even people coming back to New Zealand. We were under lockdown for extended periods, but it also really worked. The estimates are that there would have been something like 20,000 additional people having died of COVID without the lockdowns. But they led, as they did in the States, of course, they led to a really extraordinary movement, an anti kind of control movement, which was fed very much by right-wingers and nationalists, and a strange kind of coalition sometimes between racists and supporters of the indigenous Maori. And that coalesced into a kind of very strong anti-establishment and anti-Jacinda movement, which led to an invasion or an occupation of the grounds of Parliament here. It's arguable that they would have done a January 6th if they could at the Parliament in Wellington. There was huge concern and big protests about vaccine mandates. People in the police and the army and various other places, teachers were required to be vaccinated. And of course, it was extremely effective in controlling the spread of COVID until it wasn't, because of course, once we went through those various variants and the ability to control it was really broken down. But Jacinda also did a thing. It was remarkable for me to see this, especially having come out of, to some extent, the Johnson government, the Boris Johnson government in London, where its process of dealing with COVID was characterized by chaos and ignorance and stupidity and rule breaching, if you like. Jacinda Ardern did a daily press conference. She always, as they call it in New Zealand, fronted to it. She took an immense amount of personal responsibility. She didn't hide behind her health officials. And it was always striking in these daily appearances how deeply she was informed about COVID, the pandemic, what was going on. She, from my point of view as a New Zealander, deracinated New Zealander coming back, she did an absolutely extraordinary job of staying on it keep continuing the message. And I think people forget, certainly they do here, what it would have done to New Zealand, in a country of 5 million, where everybody really does know everybody pretty much, to have 20,000 further people die would have been a very, very difficult.
So in a way, could you suggest that Ardern is kind of New Zealand version of Tony Fauci, loved by some?
Yes, absolutely. No, and she had a Tony Fauci beside her, a guy called Anthony Bloomfield, who was the head of the health, and he is also now hated. He's had to resign. He's left his job out of sort of stress and exhaustion, having done that. And there's a part of the thing with Jacinda Ardern is also profound misogynism. You know, she experienced a level of vitriol and attack that I think, other than maybe Hillary Clinton, if you like, but Hillary Clinton, of course, never quite made it as leader. But I remember being absolutely stunned back in the Clinton era, Bill Clinton era, when Hillary started leading the programs to improve American health outcomes. And the vitriol and misogyny that she experienced was awful. But the Jacinda Ardern stuff was on another scale, and she faced physical threats and kind of moral threats, if you like, that no New Zealand Prime Minister had ever experienced. It was also, it gelled with a couple of other things, Andrew, that in 2019, we had one of the worst mass killings in the world at that time, when an Australian live streamed himself shooting 51 Muslim people in 2 mosques in Christchurch.
In Christchurch.
Yeah, and again, Jacinda there flew almost immediately to Christchurch, the sort of rather English style city in the South Island, and this was deeply shocking to New Zealand. And she very memorably, she wore a hijab, or at least a head covering, and arrived in Christchurch and said of these 51 people and of all of the other Muslims affected, who many of whom were refugees, they are us. And it just hung in the air as a really powerful, just the right 3 words at the time.
Yeah, but then why? I mean, that's the astonishing thing. Is yes. Why has she become? I don't think she even lives in New Zealand anymore.
No, she can't. She lives in Boston at the moment. She's working out of not MIT, but out of Harvard, I believe, or out of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, I believe. I mean, the reason I mentioned that first is that then also led to, she created a thing called the Christchurch Call with Emmanuel Macron and to some extent Mark Zuckerberg, which was an attempt, because this guy live streamed it on Facebook. It led to the likelihood, although it didn't come in the end, of hate speech laws in New Zealand. And it also fed the agenda of a pretty, I didn't realize how big it was, quite a dark, racist, or perhaps even fascist tendency amongst a small group of New Zealanders who believe in creating a kind of Christian nationalist New Zealand. And they believed that a liberal media was in cahoots with Jacinda Ardern to suppress free speech and to do gun control, which they did again. I mean, New Zealand already had very strict gun control, but that was amplified by this attack. And then when you then get that coming into COVID, you had this sense of an overarching, overbearing state that she became the beacon of.
Yeah, and if this happens in New Zealand, one wonders what hope there is anywhere.
Well, that's right. It's a very, I mean, this is, like I say, coming back, and I'm not an intellectual like you about, with the philosophical understanding, but New Zealand, there are, apart from possibly Canadians, there are very few people that one perceives to be as kind of reasonable and sensible en masse as New Zealanders. But I sent you a piece that I'd written about this. I went into this quite deeply because there is a dark heart of nasty political dialogue here, which is exclusionary. A lot of it is anti-Maori, because in the last 50 years in New Zealand, we've had huge progress in land rights recognition, recognition of the Maori language, recognition that Maoris have 25% live 25% shorter lives than white New Zealanders do, and that's kind of not exactly being unwound, but it's being questioned. And I see
Very
that
much
as,
like, in the United States.
yeah, it's about othering. Yes, as you would
Peter,
say.
I think a Mexican politician once remarked, or someone from Latin America, that when the US catches a cold, Latin America gets pneumonia.
Mm.
In terms of your analysis of this, shall we say, Trumpification of New Zealand or parts of New Zealand, do you see these things as in parallel, or do you think you had to have MAGA and Trump in America to somehow legitimize some of the stuff you've been writing about and observing in New Zealand?
Do you mean
Are the United States, is what's happening? Is that, you talked about the kind of RFK Jr. style reaction against in COVID. I'm assuming that you have an RFK Jr. style character driving a lot of this.
Yep. Yep.
Is
There's somebody promoting ivermectin.
Is it coming from America? Have you caught this kind of philosophical pneumonia because of what's happening in the United States, or whatever happened anyway?
I think so. I think there was always an underbelly. Funnily enough, the Deputy Prime Minister described it to me for my story as what he calls Christchurch skinheads. And there is, in that very English town where the mosque killings happened, there is a kind of, latent heartbeat of really unthinking conservatism. The rugby union team there is called literally the Crusaders, and they come onto the field of play riding white horses with the cross of St. George on them. It's completely insane for anybody who's read the Crusades through Arab eyes, for example. But I think what's happened to us all, whether it's in Canada with those truck drivers some years ago, whether it's in Australia, is because we're living in a world dominated by US communications platforms where the First Amendment takes precedence, however one chooses to read that. There is a permission now to speak in a way that would have otherwise been unacceptable or antisocial. And when a lot of that rhetoric comes directly from the Prime Minister, from the President, the permission is sort of quadrupled. And I think certainly here, X is a really big part of that. We have, I think, somewhere between 600 and 900,000 New Zealanders are on X here. And it is most definitely where the most right-wing conversations are held. The other thing that New Zealand has in common with the United States, and it's to get to your point of it not being necessarily chicken and egg or pneumonia, the loss of trust in the conventional media here has been profound. We have, when I was growing up, there were 48 daily newspapers in New Zealand serving a country then of about 3.5 million. You have a national broadcaster, a separate one for radio and a separate one for television, very much like, that try to operate to the standards of the BBC. And all of them have been, have lost a tremendous amount of trust and are portrayed very often as part of a kind of liberal conspiracy against right-thinking New Zealanders.
How much of this, Peter, do you take personal responsibility, given that you had very senior positions in CNN, where you and I met? You've worked very closely with Rupert Murdoch. You've worked closely also with Will Lewis, the Washington Post, former Washington Post, now chief, who just decimated the newspaper. In all seriousness, what has happened to media? You ran Wiki Tribune for a while. You've been involved with the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C. So you are as keen an observer of media, mainstream media, as anyone. What's happened over the last 7 years, Peter?
Well, in this particular case in New Zealand, you're being slightly facetious about me having responsibility for it, but I did contribute to a discussion about trust in media with various government departments, which led to the creation of a $75 million fund to support various forms of journalism that were perceived to be a threat during the COVID period when advertising collapsed and so on. And that fund has triggered almost single-handedly the most extraordinary reaction. Even my brother said to me that I was in the pocket of Jacinda Ardern because I'd been involved in setting this thing up.
She's got big pockets.
She has, but it's that backfired. I mean, it backfired for various reasons. One reason in that particular case was that in order to get the money, the journalistic organizations had to agree to abide by the Treaty of Waitangi, which is an 1840 treaty between the sovereign and Maori, in colonial times, which is what I was saying has now been implemented much more effectively over the last 50 years. And so because they did that, that was seen to be that the government was directing the news organizations. I think more broadly, Andrew, I mean, as you know, I spent my journalistic birthplace, in a sense, apart from working for newspapers in New Zealand, was Reuters news agency. And I embraced the Reuters trust principles and ethics and continue to try to live by them in all of my journalism now, because I find it's extremely difficult for me to write opinion because I'm a sort of born reporter. I think the trend of news organizations in failing to distinguish between opinion and news reporting has been incredibly damaging. It's particularly damaging, I suspect, fundamentally when everything you're reading is on your phone, because it is very hard to differentiate color-wise or whatever. The Guardian has done a very good job of trying to do this now from a sort of design point of view, where the audience can more clearly know whether they're reading commentary or opinion. But commentary has become so dominant ahead of, strong reporting or good reporting, that I think that has been a real problem. And particularly in areas like politics, where we've always had a tradition of political sketches and humor and so on that overlay it, but we no longer report Parliament the way we used to. Maybe Congress is irrelevant, of course, now. So
right. Well, we have a show on Congress. Peter, someone coming to this fresh doesn't know much about your background, might be slightly surprised when you say, "Well, you have a Reuters background. You're not biased. Yeah. You don't believe."
Well, I try. No. I try not to be, but
but some people might be listening to this and thinking, "Here's a classic example of a senior left liberal media executive. You guys have lost control of the message. Your orthodoxy about COVID and race and identity, all these things have been shattered, and you're just denying the reality of what's happened." Is that a credible narrative, that the old media that you lived in London for many years at News Corp, Reuters, CNN, the guys like you controlled the media and you've lost control of it now?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as liberal left, but probably a lot of other people would. I think, and I learned this a lot working for US organizations, and particularly working for the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, which was, unfortunately, it's defunct, but was very much a watchdog organization. The perception that journalists are liberal or lean liberal is, I think, a sort of misreading, but an understandable misreading of a very profound American aspect of journalism, which is that it is to afflict the comfortable and protect the weak. That the powerful already have a voice, and that our job is to give a voice to the voiceless. I think that's profoundly embedded in American journalism, certainly in sort of serious and responsible places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and less so perhaps in CNN. Well, actually, no, not less so. And so I think journalists can come across appearing liberal because they do these stories. But I think a bigger issue is this, well, for me, is this issue of commentary, the sort of explosion of commentary at the expense of decent reporting. Let me give you a good example. There's a piece in The Guardian yesterday by Sean Walker, their Kiev correspondent, which is clearly I know it to be the work of sort of 5 or 10 years of incredible contact building in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Russia. Deeply informed, deeply reported, has absolutely no commentary in it, but is it is the work of somebody and an organization that really cares about getting to the facts of a story. And that's, Reuters was always about facts. We didn't really even run any commentary when I was there until Reuters bought the Breaking Views commentary platform. It didn't really run any commentary at all, and that suited me fine. But you're right, that meant I never had to stick my neck out and think about what I did actually believe. Until I joined the FT, a startup at the FT, I'd never had to really write my own opinion about anything. But I generally try to make sure it's back up.
News last few days because one of their photographers,
yes,
captured, I think, an iconic image of the former Prince Andrew in the back of a car. I'm curious as to your take on the Epstein scandal in a broader media sense.
Well, let me just mention one thing.
Let me just ask
sorry, get your question out, of course. Yeah. Go ahead.
Jason Pack, the host of the Excellent Disorder podcast, he's coming on the show next week. And I think he's going to argue, or at least he told me he was going to argue, that he thinks a lot of this Epstein stuff reflects the failure of the Anglo-American media to really account for what happened under Epstein. Is there some truth to this in your view?
I think there is a lot of truth in this. I think I mentioned to you that I'm quite good friends with Michael Wolff, the American author who's done 4 books on Trump.
Was also very one of the people who's certainly involved in the Epstein papers.
Well, I know Michael's methods and I understand them, and they're often quite controversial. But he gets close to his sources. He got very close to Steve Bannon, very close to Roger Ailes. I've often thought with Michael that he's actually a bit more akin to Tom Wolfe than Michael Wolff in some respects. But Michael has
which is a nice compliment.
They actually both dress very well as well, of course. But Michael has been for at least 3 years trying to interest mainstream media outlets in his story about the Trump-Epstein connections and Epstein. Some of Michael's journalistic methods and exchanges with Epstein don't come out terribly well when you read them. But no, I don't know how invisible Epstein could have been, but he certainly made himself somewhat invisible to the rest of the media. That woman, Julie K. Brown, in the Miami Herald, has obviously done a fantastic job on that original prosecution. And you see also Tina Brown, former editor of the Daily Beast, has been able to come back and say, look, I warned you about this guy.
But she was one of the few from mainstream media who was really clear and actually looks rather good now.
She sure does. And I forget the name. Is it Landon from the New York Times, who was clearly far too close to Epstein and advising him as well? I don't know quite why that happened. But because I haven't seen too many, maybe you have, Andrew, too many media executives coming out in the Epstein files, and that slightly surprises me. I have looked for Rupert Murdoch. I have looked for
it occurred to me, thinking out loud, that Murdoch's absent in all this. You'd have thought that Epstein, in his distasteful way, would have tried to schmooze Murdoch. Maybe Murdoch just wasn't interested in Epstein.
Well, Rupert has an unbelievably strong bullshit detector, and he sees a charlatan coming from a mile away. And strange as it may seem to say, I think he's got a very strong, a strong but not always discernible moral ethic himself. And I think maybe something will come out. But I haven't seen Jeff Zucker in there. I haven't seen Larry Ellison even in new media guy. But that network of this is the Financial Times has done an incredible job on Jess Staley, the former head of Barclays, who had absolutely bullshitted his way for years on that story, and they've really claimed some very important business scalps in that. But the connections and reach that Epstein had have been absolutely extraordinary, and I imagine you look at them too. But there's a couple of I don't want to call them investigative journalists, but sort of citizen journalists, investigators, if you like, who are on Twitter at the moment, or X rather, doing the most extraordinary excavations into some of this Trump stuff about Jean-Luc Brunel, his collaborator in France, how he died, where he died, links even to the Iran-Contra cases and so on. And the difficulty is, if it's not done by somebody like the FT or Reuters or the New York Times or the Washington Post, it's much harder to be sure whether they've done their work behind the scenes and whether we can go back into the information. But I think the Financial Times deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the way it's hung on to that story. And in fact, that was them who really took down Peter Mandelson in the UK.
Right. You mentioned the Washington Post. You know Will Lewis pretty well. I mean, you've had some run-ins with him. You've worked closely with him. What do you make of what he has done to the Washington Post? We did a show last week about the impact on the literary world of the Post just closing down its entire book review section. How catastrophic is this? What's your read of Lewis's role in this undermining of mainstream media and indeed his relationship with Jeff Bezos?
Well, unusually, I'm not going to blame Will 100% singularly for this. There is a proprietor. The proprietor has obviously decided to change his approach to it. I've heard Marty Baron, who I also know a little, but not nearly as. I mean, I worked with Will at the FT, the Times. I've known him all the way through this when he was the editor of the Telegraph. I'm not going to blame Will for all of this. Somebody called me out on this the other day, but I suspect that Will said, I will preside over the cuts, and then I go. That's the only way. I don't believe that I haven't talked to Will. I've written to him about this, but I haven't asked him about it, but haven't had the chance to ask him about it. I don't believe that his turning up at the Super Bowl was what cost him his job. I believe that he implemented and got Matt Murray, the former Wall Street Journal person who's his executive editor, to do those cuts. I think those cuts are utterly reprehensible, particularly the cultural ones, but the elimination of international bureaus by the Washington Post is a disgrace, because they were having the opportunity or building on an opportunity to create a kind of American alternative to the New York Times, which has done very well internationally. A friend of mine, Anna Fifield, was the Asia editor for the Washington Post, based in Wellington in New Zealand, had been the China correspondent. It's eliminating an opportunity to create a truly independent and interesting American news source on international news. The books section thing just sounds to me like Philistinism. Especially as somebody pointed out, when Amazon really started with books. I think that we'll never. Well, I know for my own experience that when you lose the newsroom, you never get it back. It is almost impossible. He lost the newsroom from day one, or day 5, when he said we're going to do nobody. He told his own journalists that nobody was reading their copy. He insulted his own staff. Tried to force them to think about data in ways that I think is both valuable and ignorant, that data is everything and data is not everything. Data is a brilliant guide, but it isn't a god, and it is no substitute for judgment. And I think there was a lack of judgment in the way the place was being run, and a lack of purpose, which weirdly did not happen from Bezos and Marty Baron. There seems to have been a very clear understanding and lots of statements from Jeff Bezos at the time he took over about what the purpose of and opportunity that there was for that paper, for that news organization. So I think that's awful to have lost that.
Let's end with, again, the view of a well-informed, smart New Zealander of America. What do you expect the Epstein thing to do in the US? Lots of reports or lots of conversations about why the Epstein scandal so far has claimed the scalps of English people, Maxwell, of course, Prince Andrew, Mandelstam. There don't seem to be any really serious victims, at least in the US. Do you expect this to have a real impact in the US, the Epstein thing, or are senior Americans influential, wealthy, powerful figures in media, finance, sports? Are they immune to this kind of thing, whereas in the UK and maybe in New Zealand they're not?
Well, I think the level of presidential immunity, the whole shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue and getting away from still being popular, is extraordinary. The fact that Trump survived the Access Hollywood tapes. Michael Wolff made a very good point yesterday and quoted Trump as saying, "I'm not a schmuck enough to use emails." So the evidentiary trail connecting Jeffrey Epstein to Donald Trump is not the same as the evidentiary trail to everybody else. it would appear. But we still have 3 million documents that are still sitting in the Justice Department. I thought, Andrew, that the prospects of this actually turning into anything really serious for Trump, the positioning of that enormous Trump portrait on the exterior wall of the Justice Department this week was, for all of the people who talk about whether fascism is coming, totalitarianism, authoritarian, that is one of the most authoritarian things that you can possibly imagine, and is so symbolic that the Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, the FBI and the Justice Department taken together are in his pocket.
Although it seems to have come out of a moment maybe in Michael Palin's Brazil or some other slightly absurd dystopian novel. No, I'm not sure how seriously anyone in America is taking.
No, but it's the absurdity of it that brings home the reality of it, I think, and I find that terrifying. I find the Les Wexner evidence fascinating.
The Virginia secrets.
I don't think we've got Victoria's Secrets. Yeah, I don't think we've got anywhere near to the bottom of that. How that was the foundation of Epstein's wealth, and the references in some of the emails to Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon says he never met him. What's going on there? Because clearly Jez Staley knew him when he was working for.
Yeah, everybody didn't know him until they did.
That's right.
Finally, Peter, I've got a new phrase for you. Actually, I think this is your new brand. I'm going to call you the Keith Richards of New Zealand journalism. Easy question.
Actually, can I actually be the Jarvis Cocker of New Zealand journalism?
Well, I'd rather be Keith Jarvis, not Keith Jarvis, Keith Richards, but maybe that's a matter of opinion. Finally, easy question to end with, Peter. Is America done, or is this just are we going to wake up in 2 years and it's all going to be some like watching Michael Palin's Brazil and we'd suddenly get back to normal?
Yes, I do love that. That is actually my favorite film, Terry Gilliam's Brazil. I don't think America is ever done. It's every time America, people perceive it to be done, it has either a political or economic often renewal. Its ability to rebuild itself constantly is astounding and incredibly exciting when you live there, because you sort of feel as though you're part of an engine. And I'm sure you feel that, particularly in San Francisco. I think it will depend to some extent on who comes after him, whether that's Democrat or J.D. Vance or somebody worse.
Well, Peter Bale, the voice of reason, my Keith Richards from New Zealand. It's always an honor, Keith. I was going to call you
Keith Tier.
Keaton. You're certainly not Keith Tier. Peter Bale, honor to have you on the show, Peter, and we'll get you back because America, certainly this narrative, this odd story hasn't finished yet. Thank you so much.
Well, let me know if you get any feedback, and I'd love to, and I really appreciate it, Andrew. It's always good to see you too.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.